Hello students, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll solve the second reading passage of the March 2020 SAT. This is the social science passage. This passage is adapted from Jennifer Grove, Making Space, How the Brain Knows Where Things Are. The implication of the overlap between areas of the brain responsible for cognition and areas responsible for sensory and motor processing is that perhaps the operations of cognition are implemented, at least in part, via sensory and motor structures. That is, perhaps thinking also involves activating some subset of sensory and motor pathways of the brain. For example, when you mentally picture sitting on the couch in your living room, that thought might be implemented by partially activating the visual, tactile, auditory, olfactory, and motor responses that would have occurred if you were actually there. The theory that thought might involve simulating the activity patterns in our sensory and motor areas of the brain is called grounded or embodied cognition. So the first paragraph here introduces the idea of embodied cognition, which says that because there are parts of the brain that overlap with respect to cognition and with respect to sensory processing, it is natural to conclude that there would be some overlap in the thinking processes involved in the two. So for example, if you think of the couch at your house, or if you think of something that's painful, then it is likely that the same neural pathways are involved that are involved in the sensory or the tactile or visual or olfactory meaning smell, pathways. So this is called embodied cognition. Some of the evidence in favor of this view comes from behavioral experiments that show that how you respond to something depends on otherwise irrelevant features of the sensory stimulus. And of particular interest here, these seemingly irrelevant features often involve space. In one classic study, Mike Tucker and Rob Ellis at the University of Plymouth asked subjects to judge whether items were upside down or right side up. The stimuli consisted of photographs of common household objects like frying pans or spatulas. Subjects were to indicate their choice by pressing a designated button, one button for upright and the other for upside down. One button was placed near the subject's left hand and the other near the right hand. A detail we wouldn't normally consider to be important, but that was essential for what Tucker and Ellis were really getting at. So here we are introducing an experiment that would look at this concept of embodied cognition, and particularly cognition with respect to space. So the author says that the way an object is oriented in space should not be dependent on where the object is placed with respect to a person, right? But in this experiment, objects were oriented either upside down or upright, and they were placed, in some cases, they were placed near the subject's left hand, and in some cases near the right hand, which shouldn't ideally matter. But this was something that the experimenters were interested in. Secretly, Tucker and Ellis were not particularly interested in the upright inverted choices, but whether the subjects would respond faster when they had to press the button with the hand on the same side as the handle of the object in the photograph. All the objects had handles and were photographed in multiple orientations, upright with the handle on either the left or right, and inverted with the handle on either left or right. Tucker and Ellis found that when the handle on the frying pan was on the left, responses involving the left hand were indeed faster than those involving the right. Subjects also made fewer errors when the correct choice involved a match between the hand and the handle. When the objects were mirror reversed, the response pattern reversed as well, indicating that it was not simply a matter of being faster or more accurate with one hand than the other. So, in fact, Tucker and Ellis, who were conducting the experiment, found that the place where the button was kept was relevant to how quickly the subjects were able to discover or decide the orientation of the object that they were shown. So if the object was oriented with the handle to the left, and the button was to the left, then they were quicker compared to a case where the handle was to the left, but the button was to the right. And they also made sure that this was not merely a case of being more adept with one hand or the other, because when the objects were mirror reversed, which is to say that, when they inverted the left and right, then the same results obtained, which is to say that regardless of whether it was the left hand or the right hand, objects were more comfortable or were faster deciding the orientation of the handle when it was similar to where the button was placed. Another classic illustration of a seemingly unnecessary connection between space and cognition comes from mental rotation experiments. In one early study, Roger Shepard and Jacqueline Metzler presented subjects with drawings of blocks of various shapes, think Tetris, but in 3 dimensions, and asked them to judge whether 2 pictures involved the same shape from a different viewpoint or a different shape altogether. They found that how long it took the subjects to make the judgment varied proportionally with the amount of rotation that would have been needed to bring the 2 subjects into alignment had they been real. Okay, so the second experiment involved rotation, in which the experimenters, Roger Shepard and Metzler, they basically chose different shapes. And in some cases, they used the same shapes, but they rotated them, right? So for example, if it was a triangular shape, which was oriented along the XY axis, then they kind of rotated it and brought it along, let's say, the YZ plane. And they found that the time that subjects took to decide whether the shapes were the same depended on the amount of rotation that they had to mentally do to align the subjects, right? So this also proves the truth of embodied cognition, that even when there is supposedly no connection, for example, in the experiment on rotation, we do try to align objects in space before we come to a result. Both of these experiments, although strictly behavioral, suggest that mental reasoning can show signatures of real-world spatial constraints. In the frying pan experiment, there is no reason for the side of the handle to affect responses. Subjects must merely indicate whether the frying pan is upright or not, but it does. In the case of the mental rotation, there is no physical object to be actually turned, and yet the amount of time required to perform the task varies with how far such an object would have needed to be turned if it did exist. So this paragraph kind of concludes the passage by reiterating the results of the experiments and showing how they in fact show or prove the truth of embodied cognition. Okay, and then we have this table, which is about the effect of object orientation and response hand on response time. So we'll come to the table later. Let's do question 11. Which choice best represents the overall structure of the passage? Option A hypothesis is put forth, an experiment testing that hypothesis is outlined, and an explanation for the findings of that experiment is offered. A theory is described, studies exploring that theory are recounted, and the significance of the results of those studies is suggested. A generalization is presented, 2 examples of that generalization are contrasted, and a revision of that generalization is provided. A theory is introduced, potential criticism of that theory is considered, and a rebuttal of that criticism is presented. So I think the answer here should be B, right? B is a good answer. You have the introduction of the theory of embodied cognition. You then have 2 studies that explore that theory, and the passage presents those 2 studies. And then you describe the significance of the results that emerge from those studies, right? So B is a good answer. Okay, a hypothesis is put forth. The first issue with this option is the word hypothesis. I don't think what the passage does in the first paragraph is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is something which would be tested, right? While here you are actually describing a theory that has already been proved to be true through studies in the past, right? So I'm a little uncomfortable with the word hypothesis. And then I know that more than one study was mentioned. So it's not just one experiment. And yeah, so those are the things that make option A incorrect. Option C, a generalization is presented. Two examples of that generalization are contrasted. Okay, so this is not correct because both examples actually prove the truth of embodied cognition. They are not presented in the sense of contrast. And definitely the generalization or the theory is not revised. So option C is wrong. A theory is introduced. Potential criticism of that theory is considered. This is clearly wrong. There is no criticism of the theory. In fact, both studies are used to explain the truth of the theory. So D is wrong. Okay, question 12. Is this, no, this is not evidence-based. Based on the passage, how would the author most likely respond to another scientist's claim that the theory of embodied cognition cannot account for thoughts regarding abstract concepts such as peace and honesty? Okay, so I don't think the author says that the theory of embodied cognition accounts for all sorts of thoughts or all sorts of concepts, right? It only talks about concepts that are spatial, that are tactile, right? Concepts that involve sensory and motor pathways in the brain, right? So I don't think the author would necessarily disagree with this scientist because the author does not claim that embodied cognition accounts for all types of abstract concepts. So option A, by arguing that the scientist has not fully considered the mechanics of the theory of embodied cognition. B, by asserting that thoughts about abstract concepts are less common than thoughts about concrete objects. C, by suggesting that the theory of embodied cognition should be tested under different experimental conditions. And D, by conceding that the theory of embodied cognition may not account for all aspects of thought. So it's D, right? The author would concede that yes, the theory of embodied cognition will not account for abstract concepts like peace and honesty. Option A, by arguing that the scientist has not fully considered the mechanics of the theory. No, the author does not claim that the theory of embodied cognition can account for everything. So that's not the right answer. Thoughts about abstract concepts are less common. There is no mention in the passage of this. And this also seems like a really silly option because you can't really quantify thoughts about one concept versus another. And C, by suggesting that the theory of embodied cognition should be tested under different conditions. No, the author is not claiming that under different conditions, embodied cognition would start accounting for abstract ideas like peace. So C is wrong. 13, according to the passage, embodied cognition is the theory that thought emerges from reactions to certain powerful events, can be used to improve various physiological functions, may involve activation of signals that also control the body, demands conscious mental effort from the thinker. So it's C, right? This is the very definition of embodied cognition, that it involves activation of signals that are related to the control of the body, the actual sensory and motor pathways that control the body, those get activated in embodied cognition. So C is the right answer. It's got nothing to do with reactions to powerful events. There's no mention in the passage of that. So option A is wrong. There's no mention of improving physiological functions in the passage. So this is wrong. And there's no mention of conscious effort from the thinker when it comes to embodied cognition. So A, B, and D can be clearly eliminated. 14, as used in line 20, interest most nearly means. So let's look at line 20, this word. Some of the evidence in favor of this view comes from behavioral experiments that show that how you respond to something depends on otherwise irrelevant features of the sensory stimulus. And of particular interest here, these seemingly irrelevant features often involve space. So of particular interest here would mean that cognition involving space is particularly relevant or important to the discussion. So we are looking for words like that. So importance, right? That's the best answer, of particular importance in this discussion. We are not speaking of sympathy here. We are not saying of particular sympathy. That doesn't fit the context. We are not speaking of responsibility. We are speaking of areas that are of concern or that are of relevance to an experiment. And attention also does not fit the context. So the best answer is importance. 15. When the author refers to certain studies as classic in lines 21 and line 52, she most nearly means that the studies are. So line 21 here, right, in one classic study, and 52, another classic illustration. So this means that these studies are well known and they are well accepted in the scientific community. So that the studies are simple and understated in their design, based on antiquated ways of thinking, frequently performed by other researchers, long established and well regarded in the field. So classic in the context of a scientific experiment would mean that these studies are long established and well regarded. They are not simple and understated. That's not what classic means. So option A is wrong. They are not based on antiquated ways of thinking. Antiquated is outdated. So we are not saying that the studies are outdated. So this is wrong. And we don't know if these studies are performed by other researchers. So that's not what classic means. So C is also wrong. 16. Based on the passage, which statement regarding the subjects in Tucker and Ellis's experiment can most reasonably be inferred? Okay, and this is evidence-based. So let's first mark the line numbers. 21, 24, 24, 26, 26, 28, 34, 38. Okay, so 21, 24, 24, 26, 26, 28, this one, and then 34 to 38. Okay, now the question is, which statement regarding the subjects in Tucker and Ellis's experiment can most reasonably be inferred? They were unaware of the true focus of the study. They had been carefully selected based on their backgrounds. They frequently used the utensils seen in the photographs. They had unusually well-developed spatial skills. So I'm leaning towards A because I remember the author said that secretly the experimenters wanted to figure something out. Okay, so in one classic study, Tucker and Ellis asked subjects to judge whether items were upside down or right side up. Right, so this is not relevant to the secret goal of the experimenters. The stimuli consisted of photographs of common household objects like frying pan or spatulas. Okay, there is an option that talks about, yeah, so it's not, so the thing is, this is an option that is meant to confuse you. It's not about the subjects frequently using the utensils. It's about objects that are common, right? So even if you don't use it, you know that, a spatula is supposed to work a certain way. So be careful of options like this. So this is wrong. And so B is wrong. Subjects were to indicate their choice by pressing the designated button, one button for upright, another for upside down. So this is simply explaining the mechanism of the experiment. So this is not relevant. Secretly, Tucker and Ellis were not particularly interested in the upright inverted choices, but whether the subjects would respond faster when they had to press the button with the hand on the same side as the handle of the object, right? So that was the real intention of the experiment, which the subjects were not aware of. So it's A for 16, and it would be D for 17. Now, if you look at other options in 16, it's not given that the subjects had been carefully selected, so B is wrong. And there's no mention of unusually well-developed spatial skills, so D is also wrong. Okay, based on the passage, could the likelihood that most participants in Tucker and Ellis's study write with their right hands be used as an effective challenge to their conclusions? Okay, so this actually would be a no answer, because you remember there was this part where we read that, this part here. We said that subjects made fewer errors when the correct choice involved a match between the hand and the handle. When the objects were mirror reversed, the response pattern reversed as well, indicating that it was not simply a matter of being faster or more accurate with one hand than the other, right? So the experimenters were careful to ensure that the time taken to hit the button was not dependent on which hand the subjects were comfortable with, right? Because that would kind of defeat the purpose of the experiment, that if it was measuring comfort with a certain hand, then it would not measure the spatial nature of embodied cognition, right? So yeah, so this is how the experimenters made sure that the subjects were not picking up a particular button in a certain time because of their comfort with one hand over the other, right? Based on the passage, could the likelihood that most participants write with their right hands be used as an effective challenge? No, because the researchers' study design had successfully ruled out the possibility that being right-handed would be a factor in the results. So I like this option. No, because the researchers switched the photograph shown based on whether participants were right or left-handed. No, they did not switch the photographs. They had the same orientation for the photographs, but they did mirror reverse them to make sure that all possibilities were included. So this would be C, and the lines that I'm looking for are lines 47 to 51. That would be the correct evidence. 47 to 51, option D. Okay, based on the table, which statement best represents the findings about the mean response times? Right, so let me bring the table here. Let me take a screenshot. Okay, so the table is here. Subjects responded slowest when presented with objects with handles on the left for both response hands. Okay, so let's first find out the slowest. The slowest is this one, right? This takes the maximum response time. So then option A is not correct, because in this case, the object handle orientation is on the right. So A is out. Okay. Subjects responded slowest when presented with objects with handles on the right for both response hands. No, that's not true, right? So because the slowest are these, so it had to do with the object handle orientation being opposite to the response hand orientation. So it was not about left or right, and this is something that the passage also supports. Subjects responded fastest when presented with handles on the opposite side from their response hand for both object handle orientations. No, not the opposite side, the same side, right? Because in these cases, they respond the fastest. So subjects responded fastest when presented with objects with handles on the same side as their response hand, right? So it would be option D. So let me mark D. Okay. 21. Based on the passage, how would an advocate of the theory of embodied cognition most likely explain the results presented in the table? When the response hand is on the same side as the object handle, the objects in the photographs are easier to recognize. When the response hand is on the same side as the object handle, sensory areas activate more slowly and deliberately. When the response hand is on the side that is opposite the object handle, the brain must take longer to adjust the mental visualization. When the response hand is on the side that is opposite the object handle, the brain is able to picture more sharply the object to be grasped. Okay, so D is clearly wrong because we are not talking about the sharpness with which the brain perceives the picture. What about C? When the response hand is on the side that is opposite, the brain must take longer to adjust the mental visualization. So this could make sense. I'll keep it for now, but I want to see if there is a better option. B says when the response hand is on the same side, sensory areas activate more slowly and deliberately. So this clearly is not correct because when the response hand is on the same side as the object handle, then you take less time to respond, right? So the sensory areas are definitely not activating slowly. If anything, they're activating faster. When the response hand is on the same side as the object handle, the objects are easier to recognize. No, I wouldn't say they are easier to recognize. The recognition is still the same, but yes, it is quicker to recognize. So I think it's about time. It's not about ease. So I will go with option C. Okay, I think that was the only one. Yes, so let's grade this. So I have the answer key here. 11 BDC, BDC, BDADC 14, BDADC and 19, DDC, D, D and C. Okay, so we got all correct. Hope this exercise was useful. If it was, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Come back later for solutions to the other passages. I've already uploaded solutions to the literature passage, which was the first passage. And over the next few videos, I'll be uploading solutions to the remaining 3 passages. So I hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.